Sir, this receipt has a message for you.
Help? What is this?
I'm in danger. Please get me out of here.
All right, follow me.
The low hum of the upscale bistro felt like a tomb as Don Marco Valeni sat at his corner table, his dark eyes scanning the room with the automatic vigilance of a man who had built an empire on blood. Across from him sat his underboss, discussing territory and profit, words that felt like a chain Marco couldn't break. To the world, Marco was a legend, a scarred king in a custom-tailored suit. To himself, he was a man trapped by a legacy of cold authority. Then he saw her, a young waitress in a crisp white shirt, her hair pulled back with severe precision. But it wasn't her appearance that made the world tilt off its axis. It was her hand. As she reached down to place the dinner receipt on the table, her fingers trembled with a rhythm of pure, unadulterated terror. Marco's jaw tightened. He had seen fear 1,000 times, but this was different. This was a plea. He flipped the receipt over. On the stark white paper, a single word was scrawled in bold, jagged ink. Help. Time stopped. Marco's heart slammed against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He didn't look up at the girl. He looked past her. 10 feet away, standing by the kitchen doors, the restaurant manager was watching, his hand tucked subtly inside his jacket, his gaze fixed on the girl like a hawk over a mouse. What the manager didn't know was that he was staring at a man whose facial scars were maps of every mistake his enemies had ever made. To the room, Marco was a dissatisfied diner. To Keisha, he was a predator who had just realized a parasite was feeding in his own house. The soup is cold, Marco said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to come from underwater. Keisha's gaze found him for a heartbeat, and the color drained from her face. She saw the neck tattoos, the scars, and the lethal focus in his eyes. For a second, they stared at each other across a gulf of silence and pain. Then, she snatched the tray and hurried back toward the kitchen, her pace frantic. Marco stood up, pulling out his phone. His fingers flew over the screen, texting his right-hand man. Something urgent came up. Boss? His underboss asked, confused. We haven't finished discussing the harbor shipments. The shipments can wait, Marco thought, the lie tasting like copper on his tongue. 20 minutes later, his lead enforcer appeared at the bistro entrance. Boss, Marco whispered, his expression a mask of granite. Find out who owns this manager. Last known address, every contact, and do it quietly. And find out everything about that waitress. Marco's jaw clenched as he watched the kitchen door swing shut. And one more thing. She's being held. I need to know exactly who is keeping her in my city. The steam rising from the bowl of minestrone was a lie, a thin veil of warmth over a kitchen that felt like a tomb. Marco didn't need to taste it to know the atmosphere had curdled. From the corner of his eye, he tracked the manager, a man named Moretti, who stood by the service station with the stiff, unnatural posture of a sentry rather than a host. Moretti's hand remained anchored inside his blazer, his eyes never leaving Keisha as she navigated the floor. Marco had seen this layout before, not in a restaurant, but in a holding cell. The staff didn't move like servers. They moved like handlers, their eyes constantly communicating in a silent, predatory shorthand. Waitress, Marco barked, his voice cutting through the soft jazz like a serrated blade. Keisha flinched, a microscopic tremor that sent a splash of broth onto the white linen. She approached the table, her face a mask of professional compliance, but her pulse was visible in the hollow of her throat, thrumming like a trapped bird. As she reached for the bowl, Marco slammed his hand onto the table. The silver rattled, and the underboss sitting across from him jumped, but Marco's eyes were locked onto Keisha's. This soup is ice cold, he growled, the staged anger radiating from him in waves. Do you think I came here to eat slop? Get the manager. Better yet, take it back and fix it yourself before I lose my temper. Moretti began to move toward them, his expression sharpening, but Marco threw a dismissive, heavy hand up, signaling him to stay back. It was a power move, the apex predator claiming his space. Keisha leaned down to retrieve the bowl, her body shielding the view from the service station for a fleeting second. Who is in the kitchen with you? Marco whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound, barely moving his lips. Keisha's hands gripped the edge of the bowl until her knuckles turned the color of ash. She didn't look up, but her lips trembled as she breathed out a single, terrified word. Arm. Yes, she exhaled, the word caught in a sob she refused to let out. Marco grabbed her wrist, making it look like an act of aggression to any onlooker, but his thumb pressed firmly against her skin in a steadying rhythm. Go back. Act like I'm a monster. When I leave, don't go to the locker room. Stay near the service exit. He released her, shoving the bowl toward her chest. Go, and don't make me ask again. Keisha turned and fled toward the kitchen, her head bowed in a perfect imitation of a shamed employee. Marco sat back, his face returning to a mask of bored, wealthy indifference, but beneath the table, his blood was screaming. He wasn't just in a bistro, he was in a nest, and he was about to burn it down. The return of the soup was a choreographed act of survival. Keisha reappeared with a fresh bowl, her movements mechanical, her eyes fixed on the ceramic rim to avoid the scorching gaze of Moretti. As she set the bowl down, she fumbled with a secondary menu, letting it slide onto the table beside Marco's elbow. To any observer, it was the clumsy mistake of a girl rattled by a powerful man's temper. To Marco, it was a tactical briefing. I'm so sorry, sir, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. I brought the wine list, perhaps a vintage to settle the meal? Marco leaned in, his shadow eclipsing the table. He didn't look at the wine list. He looked at her trembling finger as it traced a line beneath 3 specific items on the menu. Each item corresponded to a table number in the room. His eyes flicked across the floor, identifying the diners at those tables. Men in ill-fitting suits who hadn't touched their plates, their bodies coiled with the unmistakable tension of hired muscle. But it was her final gesture that turned Marco's blood to liquid nitrogen. She brushed a stray crumb toward the edge of the table, her nail digging into the wood directly toward the underboss sitting across from him. Marco's gaze shifted to the man he had called his brother for a decade. Silvio was sipping a glass of Barolo, his expression one of bored amusement at Marco's outburst. Marco felt the world tilt. The human trafficking ring wasn't just operating in his territory, it was being managed by his own right hand, using Marco's reputation as a shield to hide the most disgusting of sins. The Barolo is excellent tonight, isn't it, Silvio? Marco asked, his voice dropping into a register that made the underboss pause mid-sip. Finest in the cellar, boss, Silvio replied with a casual shrug. Why so tense? It's just a waitress. Marco looked back at Keisha. Through the veil of her professional mask, she saw the realization dawn behind his eyes. She saw the scarred predator recognize the parasite at his own table. In that heartbeat, the dynamic of the room shifted. Marco wasn't just a diner anymore. He was a bomb with a hair trigger. You're right, Silvio, Marco said, his jaw clenching so hard it felt like his teeth might shatter. She's just a waitress. And you're just a man who forgot who I am. He reached for his napkin, wiping his mouth with a slow, deliberate precision that signaled the end of the meal and the beginning of a massacre. He didn't need to see the kitchen to know the exit was blocked. He just needed to know if he could kill Silvio before the men at the other tables reached for their waistbands. The secret edge was gone. The war had officially moved to the dinner table. The tension in the room was a physical weight, thick enough to choke the life out of the unsuspecting diners at the neighboring tables. Marco sat perfectly still, his senses dialed to a frequency only a man who lived on the edge of death could perceive. He watched Keisha retreat toward the kitchen, her steps faltering as Moretti, the manager, intercepted her. Moretti didn't raise his voice, but the way he leaned into her space, predatory and cold, made Marco's hand drop beneath the table to the holster at his hip. The manager's lips moved near her ear, and though the jazz continued to purr from the speakers, Marco caught the jagged edge of the words. Dry your eyes and pack your things, Moretti hissed, his hand tightening on her upper arm. The transport is early. You're leaving for the airport in 1 hour. If you make another scene like you did with Valeni, you won't even make it to the plane. The air in Marco's lungs turned to ice. 1 hour. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. He looked back at Silvio, who was casually swirling his wine, blissfully unaware that he was sitting across from his own executioner. Marco knew that if he drew his weapon now, the 3 tables of muscle would erupt, and Keisha would be caught in the crossfire, or worse, used as a human shield. He needed a distraction, something loud enough to mask a kidnapping but controlled enough to keep the civilian body count at 0. His eyes flicked to the heavy, ornate chandelier hanging over the center of the room, and then back to the service exit Keisha had mentioned. "Silvio," Marco said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I find I've lost my appetite for food. I think I'd rather have an apology." "An apology? For what, boss?" Silvio asked, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. "For thinking I was too old to smell a rat in my own kitchen," Marco replied. He stood up slowly, the movement drawing the eyes of every handler in the room. He didn't look at them. He looked at Keisha, who was being pushed toward the back hallway. He had 60 minutes to dismantle a decade of loyalty and save a woman whose only crime was asking for help. As he signaled his lead enforcer through the front window with a sharp, two-finger tap against his jaw, Marco realized that by the time the sun rose, the Valeni name would either be a memory or a legend. He stepped away from the table, not toward the front door, but directly into the path of the manager, his face a mask of scarred, unyielding iron. The hunt had moved from the shadows to the clock, and Marco Valeni didn't plan on being late. The air in the bistro shattered as Marco erupted with a violence that was both sudden and perfectly measured. He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the marble floor like a dying animal, drawing every eye in the room. Before Moretti could even process the movement, Marco's hand shot out, catching Keisha by the upper arm with a grip that looked brutal but left just enough space for her to breathe. "You think you can play me?" Marco's roar was a physical force, vibrating the stemware on the nearby tables. He reached into his pocket and then slammed his other hand onto the white linen. "Empty. My watch. The Patek. It was on the table 2 minutes ago. Where is it?" Keisha played her part with the instinct of the desperate. She gasped, her eyes widening in a terror that was only half-staged, her hands coming up to clutch at his sleeve. "I didn't, sir. I haven't touched anything." "Liar," Marco hissed, his face a mask of scarred, righteous fury. He looked toward the manager, who had frozen mid-step, his hand hovering uncertainly near his jacket. "Moretti, your girl here just made the biggest mistake of her short life. She's coming with me. We're going to find my property, and if I don't like the answers I get, I'm coming back for the deed to this building." Moretti stepped forward, his eyes darting to the muscle at the surrounding tables. "Don Marco, please, let my men handle her. We have protocols for." "I am the protocol." Marco moved with the speed of a striking cobra, hauling Keisha toward the front entrance. "Silvio, stay here. Ensure no one leaves. If that watch isn't found in the next 10 minutes, I'll consider you an accomplice." Silvio sat frozen, the glass of Barolo halfway to his lips, caught in the crossfire of Marco's calculated madness. The handlers at the table shifted, their hands twitching toward their waistbands, but they were paralyzed by the hierarchy. You didn't draw on the Don, even when he was acting like a lunatic. Marco didn't give them a chance to recover. He dragged Keisha through the heavy oak doors and into the biting chill of the night air. He didn't slow down until they reached his armored Bentley, idling at the curb like a predatory beast. He threw the door open and shoved her into the back seat, following her in and slamming the door before the valet could even blink. "Drive," Marco barked at his enforcer. As the car lurched into the flow of traffic, the arresting grip on Keisha's arm softened instantly. She collapsed against the leather upholstery, her chest heaving with jagged, sobbing breaths. Marco didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the restaurant shrink into the distance. "They're going to come for me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Let them," Marco replied, his voice a low, lethal promise as he pulled a handgun from his holster and checked the chamber. "They've spent years thinking I was a businessman. It's time they remembered I'm a butcher." The Bentley wove through the industrial labyrinth of the city's edge, eventually pulling into a nondescript warehouse that smelled of old motor oil and cold salt. Inside, a reinforced steel door led to a small, windowless apartment, a safe house kept off every official Valeni ledger. Marco finally stopped, the engine's hum dying into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Keisha sat on the edge of a worn leather sofa, her body still vibrating with the aftershocks of the adrenaline. Marco stood by the door, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light, his hands stained with the ink of the receipt he still held. He watched her for a long moment, the predator's mask softening into something more human, though no less dangerous. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low gravel. "But the clock hasn't stopped. You told me there were 4 armed men in the kitchen. How many more are there?" Keisha looked up, her eyes hollowing out as the memories flooded back. "It's not just the restaurant, Mr. Valeni. It's a holding facility at the old canning factory on 4th. There are 12 other girls. Some are younger than me. They're moving them all tonight. Because of what I did, because I spoke to you, they'll move the schedule up. They'll be gone before dawn." Marco felt a cold, familiar iron settle in his gut. The canning factory was Silvio's primary distribution hub. To strike it wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a declaration of civil war. He looked at the scars on his knuckles, earned over decades of maintaining a status quo that he now realized was built on a foundation of filth. He could take Keisha to the state line, give her a stack of cash, and walk away. He could maintain his peace with Silvio, keep his empire intact, and pretend the canning factory didn't exist. It was the quiet choice, the easy choice. "They think you're just a witness," Marco murmured, more to himself than to her. "They think I'm just protecting my reputation." He turned to the gun locker at the back of the room, the heavy tumblers clicking open with a sound like a gavel. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw the catalyst for his own reckoning. If he stayed silent, he was an accomplice. If he fought, he would likely burn his entire world to the ground. "Get some water," Marco ordered, his voice shifting back into the tone of a commander. He reached for a heavy tactical vest and a customized assault rifle. "I'm not going to the state line. I'm going to 4th Street. Keisha stood up, her fear replaced by a fragile, desperate hope. "You're going alone?" Marco checked the magazine of his sidearm, the metal clicking home with lethal finality. "I've spent 10 years building an army of ghosts. It's time I found out if any of them still remember what honor looks like." The headlights of a black SUV swept across the safe house windows, a predatory eye searching the dark. Marco didn't flinch. He sat in the center of the room, the tactical vest hidden under a silk robe, his scarred face illuminated by a single, low-hanging bulb. Keisha was behind him, tucked into the crawl space beneath the floorboards, a silence so absolute she might as well have been a ghost. A heavy knock rattled the door, 3 rhythmic thumps followed by a pause. The signature of Silvio. Marco opened the door, his frame filling the entrance, his expression a mask of bored, cold irritation. Silvio stepped in, his eyes darting across the small room, his usual smirk replaced by a twitching anxiety. He looked like a man who had lost a winning lottery ticket and was terrified of who might find it. "Don Marco," Silvio began, his voice forced and oily. "The restaurant, it's a mess. Moretti says the girl is still missing. He's worried about your property. I thought I'd come personally to see if the watch had been recovered." Marco leaned against the doorframe, lighting a cigar with hands that were steady as stone. He took a long drag, the cherry glowing like a warning light. "The girl was useless, Silvio. She cried. She screamed. She swore she knew nothing. I grew tired of the noise." Silvio's gaze drifted to the scuff marks on the floor. "So, where is she?" "Moretti has a protocol for staff who cause trouble. He'd like to handle the disciplinary measures himself." "Moretti handles what I tell him to handle," Marco growled, his voice dropping into a register of lethal authority. He stepped into Silvio's personal space, the scent of tobacco and old leather overwhelming the underboss's expensive cologne. "Are you questioning how I manage a thief in my own territory, Silvio? Or is there a reason you're so desperate to find a common waitress?" Silvio paled, his confidence fraying at the edges. He was looking for a crack in Marco's armor, searching for a sign that the butcher had gone soft. Marco channeled every ounce of the monster he had been for 20 years, his eyes turning into 2 black pits of indifference. "She's in the trunk of a car at the bottom of the Hudson by now for all I care," Marco lied, the words tasting like ash. "Unless, of course, she was worth more than a watch. Is there something you haven't told me about the canning factory, Silvio?" The silence that followed was a high-wire act. Silvio swallowed hard, his eyes dropping. "No, boss. Nothing. Just making sure the business is clean." "It's going to be very clean by morning," Marco replied, a faint, terrifying smile touching his lips. As Silvio retreated back to his SUV, Marco watched the taillights fade. He had maintained the mask, but the weight of it was becoming unbearable. He turned back to the room, reaching down to lift the floorboards. The psychological war was over. The physical one was about to begin. The underboss had shown his hand, and now Marco was going to cut it off. The fog rolling off the harbor was thick as wool, swallowing the orange glow of the industrial lamps and turning the old canning factory into a hulking, rusted ghost. Marco moved through the mist with a lethal, silent efficiency, his tactical boots ghosting over the damp pavement. Beside him, Keisha moved with a surprising, desperate grace. He had tried to leave her in the car, but the fire in her eyes had been a command he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the only one who knew the layout of the labyrinth. "There," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the rhythmic sloshing of the tide. She pointed toward a side-loading bay where two men stood guard, their cigarettes glowing like low-hanging embers. "That's the intake. They keep the keys in the foreman's office just past the first row of boilers." Marco nodded, his hand steady as he signaled his few loyalists to flank the perimeter. He watched Keisha as she crept forward, staying low behind a stack of shipping pallets. Her bravery was a revelation, a raw, unpolished iron that matched his own. She was risking the very freedom he had just given her to ensure no one else was left behind. The breach was sudden and absolute. Marco moved like a shadow given form, neutralizing the guards with silent, surgical precision before they could even drop their embers. He kicked the heavy steel door open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space like a thunderclap. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of stale salt and fear. Keisha didn't wait for his command. She sprinted toward the foreman's desk, dodging between the heavy machinery she had scrubbed just hours before. A guard lunged from the shadows, but Marco caught him mid-stride, a single, brutal strike sending the man to the floor. Keisha grabbed the heavy ring of keys from the wall, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. "The basement level," she shouted, her voice finally breaking the silence of the raid. "The blue door at the back." Marco followed her lead, his rifle raised, clearing the path as she fumbled with the locks of a heavy iron grate. As the door swung open, the sight of a dozen huddling figures draped in thin blankets met them. The relief that washed over Keisha's face was the brightest thing in the dark warehouse. She began ushering them out, her voice a soothing contrast to the violence of the night. Marco stood guard at the threshold, watching her work. He had spent his life destroying things, but watching Keisha free those women, he realized he was finally part of a construction, a rebuilding of a moral code he thought he had buried decades ago. The cleansing wasn't just about the bullets. It was about the light she was bringing into his hollowed-out world. The silence following the rescue was short-lived, shattered by the sharp, metallic crack of a high-caliber rifle echoing off the harbor's concrete walls. The bullet sparked against a rusted shipping container inches from Keisha's head. Marco didn't think. He pivoted, his large frame becoming a human shield as he shoved Keisha toward the cover of a heavy industrial generator. A second shot followed, then a third. Marco felt a searing, white-hot bloom of agony in his shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, the cold asphalt pressing against his cheek. "Marco!" Keisha's scream was a raw, visceral sound that cut through the darkness. She crawled toward him, her hands reaching out, but he forced himself up, his teeth bared in a snarl of defiant pain. Through the haze of the fog, he saw the shooter, Silvio's personal assassin, perched on a catwalk overlooking the bay. The man was a professional, already lining up a killing blow. Marco's vision blurred, the blood soaking through his charcoal suit, staining the white silk of his shirt a deep, ruinous crimson. He looked at Keisha, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with the terror she was feeling for him, not for herself. He raised his sidearm, his wounded arm shaking, his breathing a ragged, shallow mess. He waited for the heartbeat between breaths, for the moment where the world stood still. He fired once. The assassin tumbled from the catwalk, a silent shadow falling into the black depths of the Atlantic. Marco slumped back against the generator, his breath coming in jagged hitches. Keisha was over him instantly, tearing at her apron to create a makeshift bandage, her movements frantic yet focused. As she pressed the fabric against his shoulder, Marco looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, and now covered in fresh blood. He had spent his life marked by the violence of greed, power, and betrayal. His face was a map of sins he had committed in the name of a cold throne. But as he looked at the women huddled in the distance, and the brave waitress whose life he had just bought with his own blood, he felt a strange, quiet peace settle over his heart. For 20 years, his scars had been a source of shame and a warning to his enemies. But this wound was different. "Stay with me, Marco," Keisha whispered, her voice a desperate command. He managed a faint, bloody smile, his eyes searching hers. For the first time in his long, dark life, he didn't feel like a monster. He realized that these new scars wouldn't be reminders of what he had taken from the world, but of what he had finally given back. This wasn't a wound of the Mafia. It was the mark of a man who had fought a good fight. The pain was absolute, but the redemption was finally real. The cleansing of the city didn't happen with a single explosion, but with the cold, systematic precision of a man who had finally found a purpose for his darkness. In the weeks following the dockside raid, Don Marco Valeni moved through his territory like a winter gale. The Valeni name, once synonymous with a quiet complicity in the shadows, became a death sentence for anyone caught in the trade of human lives. He didn't just fire the men responsible, he erased their influence, dismantling the infrastructure Silvio had spent years building until the underboss himself vanished into the silence of the Atlantic. But the true victory wasn't found in the bodies dropped or the ledgers burned. It was found in a small, sun-drenched storefront on the other side of the city, far from the blood-stained marble of the bistro. Keisha stood behind a polished oak counter, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries replacing the scent of stale salt and fear. She wore a simple green apron, her hair pulled back just as it had been that night, but the wide, steady terror in her eyes had been replaced by a bright, resilient light. The bistro had been a cage. This was her sanctuary. Marco had provided the deed, the startup capital, and the security, all delivered through anonymous channels that never bore his name. He knew that for her to truly be free, she could never feel beholden to a ghost. Marco sat in the back of a blacked-out sedan across the street, his wounded shoulder a dull, thrumming ache beneath his suit. He watched through the tinted glass as Keisha laughed, handing a cup to a customer with hands that no longer trembled. She was a success, a woman who had used her courage to buy a future. His lead enforcer sat in the driver's seat, glancing at the rearview mirror. "She's doing well, boss. The neighborhood loves her. She's safe." Marco nodded slowly, his scarred face illuminated by the passing streetlights. He was no longer the man who expected nothing but subservience and silence. He was a guardian, a sovereign who had traded a throne of gold for a watchtower in the shadows. He had wiped the rot from his city, not to be a hero, but to be worthy of the receipt he still kept folded in his breast pocket, the one that simply said help. "Good," Marco whispered, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "Make sure the patrols stay invisible. She should never have to look over her shoulder again." As the car pulled away, merging into the pulse of the city, Marco Valeni didn't look back. He had a new code now, written in the scars of a good fight. He would remain in the dark so that she could stay in the light, a silent sentinel ensuring that in his city, a plea for help would always find a protector.